And now I'm going to call onto the stage a couple of friends to discuss this very question and to see how we take it forward. First, can I ask Sean Tarbuck, who's the CEO of the International Cooperative Mutual Insurers Federation, extraordinary large group of insurers, to join me, and also a member of our Climate Bond Standards Board. Margarita Pirovska, who's the Director of Policy at the Principles for Responsible Investment, who we are collaborating with on so many fronts, and is doing a fantastic job of driving a progressive policy agenda. On the screen, we have two great friends. We have Arun Kumar Sharma, Senior Advisor of the World Bank Private Sector Investment Labs, who's going to talk about this amazing change that's happening under Ajay Banga and this new initiative. And then we have Jacob Thoma, my good friend, occasionally partner in arguments, project director of an inevitable policy response, and also running the THEA in Finance Labs in Berlin. This session is about what's going to happen in the future and what we need to do. I'm going to ask Jacob to kick us off, to tell us a little bit about the inevitable policy response and what that is telling us as a background to our conversation. Go, Jacob.
Thanks, Sean, and I hope the audio is working well, and welcome to everyone in the room and all those joining digitally. It is, as ever, impressive, the convening power of Climate Bonds Initiative, and so it's a privilege to speak to all of you today. The inevitable policy response, which I lead as the project director, is an attempt to actually forecast the climate transition. And this is, bizarrely, one might think, an exercise that doesn't happen very often. We live in a world of narratives between the increasingly impossible, dare I say, 1.5 no overshoot future. And I think that is increasingly a less controversial statement. And a lot of the doomsday work that comes out of a range of organizations, including the UN, that we are on a 3-degree pathway or a 2.6-degree pathway, and some even see us on a 4-degree pathway. Of course, that doomsday narrative does not reflect any notion of any policy change that might happen over the next 80 years. It simply freezes just what we've done today. And as Sean already outlined, this is an eminently unreasonable way to think about the future. So what will this future actually bring? Well, we've surveyed over 100 climate policy experts around the world as to a set of 300 individual policies, and then looked at the regulatory evidence across these policies to build a real forecast. What is the most likely outcome? And what is fascinating, I think, about this work is that we now really see the most likely outcome that we will reach the well below 2-degree goal. And I think this comes as a surprise to many who are, as I said, trapped in these kind of poles of 1.5 and 3 degrees and the like. But the evidence of the last 2 years, the policies Sean highlighted, and of course, those that he did in around the world, thinking about the deforestation measures in Indonesia and Brazil, and the OECD now say that over half of the policies that we need to get to well below 2 degrees are in motion. And in the OECD, that number is even higher. That is almost 90%. And so this is the reality that investors are now looking at, that the Paris Agreement increasingly, and that, of course, I speak to the well below 2-degree target, is the most likely outcome. And of course, it also puts in play the idea that eventually we may continue to pursue efforts to get back down to 1.5.
Jacob, implications for what we need to do to ensure this can happen, which is I'm not going to say it's a rosy outcome, because getting to one point is still going to be very tough for the planet, but to ensure that we don't go beyond. What are your thoughts on this conversation?
Absolutely. And of course, there's a lot of work left to do. I don't want to send the message that we can sort of pack up, we've achieved it. To get to this forecast, plenty of work is left. But it now seems more likely than not that we'll actually do the work. And this speaks to the change of winds, Sean, that you highlighted. You started by talking about risk. And I think this is actually now the biggest barrier to the transition. The cost competitiveness across energy, transport, and some people are talking about heating now as well as a sort of a subset of the energy system, and in areas of industry and land use, now mean that low carbon alternatives are cheaper without policy support across over half, and depending on how you measure, perhaps upwards of 2/3 of all emissions that we are emitting last year. Which means that the biggest issue we have is putting spades in the ground. We need to take the old emissions assets out of the system and build the new ones. And the biggest barrier to putting those spades in the ground is, in fact, risk profile. And I don't just mean the individual risk profile that new technologies have suffered from, which was a big challenge for renewables for many years, but also the macro risk profile, Sean, that you described, right? How are we going to be able to transform many emerging markets, energy systems, transport systems, and in manufacturing and industrial sectors, if we are living in what some people call a polycrisis world, where the risk return profile just makes investability the biggest concern for investors. And so I think this is where really the time of financial regulation initiatives of the kind, Sean, that obviously climate bonds is involved in, come to the forefront. Because de-risking here, and I don't just mean the traditional de-risking of public development banks, but comprehensive de-risking, the macro de-risking, insurance systems, central bank balance sheets, and of course, disclosure frameworks and everything that comes with it is now the biggest barrier to the transition, in my view, and the key to unlocking the Paris Agreement objectives.
Fantastic. Thank you. I mean, Arun, that's one for you to pick up in a minute. But first, let me go to Margarita at Principles for Responsible Investment. You've been doing a lot of thinking about this issue about how we organize ourselves sustainably, because, of course, investment, our big investors are global now. They can't just restrict their investments to the UK or to Malaysia. They want to look across the world. So they're looking for how the world is improving as an environment for their investments. What do we need to do? What's your thinking? And what are we doing?
It's a big question, but I wanted to say that in your amazing speech, you already said practically everything that I was prepared to say. But first, I wanted to go back to what Jakob said. I mean, whatever the numbers crunched out of scenarios are pointing to, this is not going to happen. When we do scenario analysis to see where the world will be in terms of energy supply and demand or any other scenarios, we usually get it wrong. So already we need to be clear that 1.5 is the goal, is the political objective, is the Paris Agreement, is for 2050, and no one can say what the world will look like in 2050. The only thing we can do is set policies, regulations, investment practices to point to this direction, which, as Sean said, is not even a target, it's the minimum required for us to continue to be in a place where the social and environmental fundamentals on which economic growth and financial returns rely are still there. So let's focus on 1.5. So the second thing is, you sounded quite optimistic in your speech, and I totally agree with that. Things are changing, the tides are changing. At our PRI in-person policy conference in Tokyo earlier this year, we had a keynote by Al Gore. And you know what? For the first time, I've heard Al Gore optimistic. So this is really, this illustrates that the tides are turning and the direction of travel is clear. And a lot of key stakeholders that will guarantee whether we get there or not are already convinced and already working on it. And this is not just this room. This goes into the mainstream out there. And this is why there are also so many attacks by people who suddenly discover who we are, what we do, and actually what this all means for global economies. So in terms of how we think about the transition, a key change that we have observed, so I lead the policy team, so I work mostly with policymakers and regulators to support our signatories to have this enabling environment to be able to invest for the economic transition. So we are seeing this transition from the time when it was environment agencies, environment ministries, and the social environmental folks were pushing some reforms within their governments and usually remained unheard by their colleagues. Now this is going to finance ministers, and it is going beyond. It is going to a whole of government approach. You mentioned Denmark earlier. We can talk about it later. But essentially, the way we think about the transition is not disclosures. The way we think about the transition is not transition finance. It is an entirely new whole of government approach where the responsibility and the duties to align industries, companies, society with 1.5 is going to be spread throughout the government, from finance to economy, to industry, to transport, to agri, to education, and so on. This is about the entire economy. It's not just about energy or energy and transport or just investors. It is about a whole of government approach that we're starting to see across many markets, including hopefully here in the UK.
Hopefully here in the UK. But certainly we're seeing it in the major markets. We've seen an aggressive administration in the US, dogged by domestic political issues. There's a question we'll come back to about what the future looks like. We've seen significant change in the EU, certainly clouded by the imbroglio around the war and the impacts of the war, which have been challenging, very difficult, but that ambition has increased. We certainly expect the EU to exceed its 2030 targets at the moment on current trajectories, but we'll see. And then, of course, in Japan, where the beast is moving, not to mention the complicated story out of China, where we see amazing pushes around green energy, around climate action. We'll see transition taxonomies being developed, we believe, in China, all sorts of other measures coming through. But at the same time, there's been a big push to make sure that we have a smooth transition, that the people in Shandong province in the coal industry don't get fired, they have a job still, that we make sure that the lights get turned on in Sichuan when we run out of energy to power our air conditioning because the Three Gorges Dam is empty, which means build more coal-fired power stations. It's a mess. It's a challenge. It's a difficult economy to deal with. But it is absolutely untrue to say change isn't happening. It's extraordinary change. And then in India, where in the last 6 months, I've had numerous conversations with the CFOs or heads of power companies who are telling me there is no new capex in coal. Gone, done. This isn't a policy position. This isn't the government saying, okay, we're going to support climate change. This is because renewable energy is more profitable. They're shifting and they can. So coal is over. Gas is probably over because of the spike in gas prices last year and how it blew out the current account deficit in India. So across the major economies, this sort of change is happening. Well, that's why I'm optimistic. But like I said, it's 5 minutes to midnight. So it's very much cutting it close. In all of this, there's the issue of how we manage risk and manage volatility. Of course, what we've done in the last 200 years plus is develop this amazing set of tools and services called insurance. Like, it's extraordinary how we've managed to mutualize risk across whole sectors, how we've developed a response which allows us to be able to have a disaster and rebuild fast, which is, of course, the theme of the 21st century now. Well, Sean's been a doyen of the insurance industry, but also wears another hat as a member of the B20, part of the G20 program, and has been working on climate change. Sean, tell us what's going on and what can make us feel hopeful in this particular sector.
Thanks, Sean. First and foremost, you stole all my lines as well, so thanks. But I would say if you can get this hashtag going, it's hashtag 2 Seans are better than 1. So we always say that we meet in strange places. Like Sean and I first met probably 12 years ago when CBI was just 2 people. And now look at it, look at the momentum you've created. And it's absolutely fantastic. But I want to... I do want to go back on that word momentum because you brought it up and put a bit more colour to why we're seeing this momentum, or what we might call a coalition of the willing now, because there's still a lot of people on the outside. There's not enough in the coalition just yet. But if we go back to 2015, when all of these great agreements, the Sendai Agreement, the SDGs, the Paris Climate Agreement, I was at all those, as was Sean. And honestly, as business people going into that world of governments and UN, it was like that. Why are you here? What are you doing? We don't want you here. We can solve these problems all by ourselves. Roll on 8 years. Again, we had the midterm review for the Sendai Agreements in May, and we've had the SDGs. And the report back from the UN is UN are failing and government are failing. So we've had 8 years at this. And coming back to partnerships and collaborations and SDG 17, unless we grab that one now and are allowed to come into the inner circle, which is starting to happen. COP28 will definitely be a lot more business people there than have ever been at any previous COP. Unless we're allowed to come in and play in this space of we're all in this together, we're not going to get this done. So I am optimistic like Sean is. I'm a born optimist. You have to be from Liverpool. So it's, and I really think we are at the cusp, as you say, the momentum is building. It was when I was at the New York in May for the UNDRR Sendai Agreement midterm review. The head of the UNDRR is a wonderful lady called Mami Misatori, and she pulled together a group of 120 great and the good from around the world, mostly government, mostly UN, and 12 tables of 10, and one person on each table was from business. I think I was the only insurance person there, that we had banks and investment houses and stuff. The whole purpose, and hats off to Mami there, and it was introduced by the Secretary General and Amina Mohammed as well. That group was there to collaborate. They didn't know it. We knew it from the business side, but they didn't know it. And the first person I talked to was Deputy Prime Minister of Barbados, and then we had the Tongan Prime Minister there, and someone from Brazil and someone from Canada. They were like caught in the headlights. They didn't know what was going on. And this is the problem with governments. It's too short term. They blame the industry for being short term, but it's not. We're actually long term. You know, in the insurance industry, we plan 200 years ahead. In governments, they plan 1 year ahead. So the short term problem is there. And I'm delighted to hear what you just said, Margarita. They're all looking at whole of system governments. That's what they need to do. Is it happening? Not yet. Definitely not yet. But if they're thinking that way, then maybe we can force them down that road together. And that's the main thing. We're all in this together. The UN is clouded with bureaucracy. It can't get things done. It's very slow and moving. We all know that. But we need the UN. They are the glue that pull us together. Now, business, yes, we have challenges as well. You know, we need to embrace the triple bottom line. That's not a new saying. That's been around for 20 plus years. But people, planet, and profit, probably in equal forces, is what we all need to do now. Become responsible global citizens. That's not happening across all of businesses yet. So we've all got our failings. And I just want to point out one thing that came out of 2015 is the insurance industry. So, okay, I represent the mutuals and co-ops, but we all play in this space nicely together. The insurance industry, the UN, the World Bank, and now a couple of the governments, particularly shout out to Germany, who've really led a lot of the resilience side, have formed together to form the Insurance Development Forum, the IDF. It's a powerful group of people that sit around that table. We meet twice a year. The IDF head office is just around the corner here in Biddulph. And it's absolutely starting to gather a lot of momentum. They've got some wonderful things around protecting people in emerging states called the Global Shield, which is funded mostly by the German government, by about 8 other governments as well. I think they've collectively put $240 million into the pot in order to try and help emerging countries. It's not a small play. It's a big play in emerging countries, to go to what you said about protecting those who need protecting the most, who aren't in Western countries. So I think that organization alone, and we're one of the founders of that, we're very proud that we've come together as a private-public partnership to try and help with the 2030 agenda. I don't think any other industry's done that. I don't think banking has, I don't think investment has. I'm just saying that is one way forward. It took probably 4 years to understand how each other works and what the KPIs and what the buzzwords were around each other. It wasn't an easy thing, and it nearly fell over, but we stuck at it, and we've got to keep going at it. And in that space, we can all achieve something. Now, that is the industry's face out to the public. What's happening back in our offices, I think, is slightly different. And if I just look at my members in particular, you mentioned about transition. I think transition is an outcome from having the right strategy in place. And we had a meeting here just last week on sustainability. And one of our largest members, a German member called Arun, probably not the biggest in Germany, but I think second or third, basically said, we haven't got a strategy now, we have a sustainability strategy. And when you start to look at all companies around the world, you want to get rid of the strategy and just have one strategy. It's called sustainability. And within that, when you look at the impact reports that all of these companies are doing, you have to actually then see what they're doing around the transition. Because we've seen a big influx of certainly my members doing net zero commitments, joining the PRI, joining the PSI. These decisions are not made easily. These decisions are made because the mutual or cooperative really wants to make a difference. And then comes the sustainability strategy, then comes your net zero commitment, and then comes your transition. So on the micro level of organizations, and you talk mostly about the macro level of how we're doing it from down there, you need the bottom-up approach. We need to get into the boardrooms and the senior management to make those changes, to make them believe. And I spent a lot of time in the last 2 years talking to those particular people to try and make sure they understand what they're getting into and make sure they make the right commitments. Because if we don't get the grassroots and the communities moving, we really can't succeed in this. So that's where I'm seeing huge momentum now in gathering of that and getting much, much better. So I'm in your boat. I'm very positive. I think we're going to get there. And it's going to be a curve like that. And we're starting to see we're sort of at the bottom of that upward trajectory now.
You heard that? At the bottom of the J curve. I think we're going to get there. And that's what we've got to bear in mind. It's not certain. It only will happen with a lot of effort, a lot of work on our parts. One of those people who's doing a lot of work in this area is Arun Sharma, who is tackling the issue of the relationship between private capital and public sector pools of capital, development banks, with that agenda that Jacob raised earlier, comprehensive de-risking. De-risking isn't just blended finance and junior capital. It's also hand-holding. It's also the due diligence work. If an investor in London finds very hard to do in India or Brazil, development banks can work with that. There's a lot of aspects. At least I think so. Arun, are you there? Can you talk to us about this project?
Yes. Well, thank you very much, Sean, for the opportunity. And it's been a pleasure listening to the co-panelists. It's also encouraging to see both a dose of reality and a dose of optimism. I think both are relevant and necessary. And that's the environment in which all of us are operating. And I think this, this major shift that we're seeing in multiple areas of this very complex topic, we're also seeing that under our new president, Vanga, on having the World Bank play the role it's being asked to play by our shareholders and essentially the global stakeholders in this existential issue that we all face. But the reality is that as an institution that was formed at the end of World War II and meant to develop or help countries recover from that point and then evolving over into a global DFI over the years, its size and scope is dwarfed by the size of this current challenge because, as somebody pointed out earlier in the conversation, we're looking at changing whole economies. So we're changing not one sector, we're not looking at changing one country, we're looking at literally changing all the economies across the board of all the countries, literally. And that's really not within the financial capacity of any one institution, least of all, a relatively small development institution compared to the size of the issue, like the World Bank. So clearly there are 2 or 3 things that we're doing that can be done, which is expanding the ability of the World Bank to deliver more financing for these priorities by essentially becoming more efficient institutions. So, and what is many of you already know as the evolution roadmap, where we're trying to see whether we can become able to lend a lot more money without really going back and burdening our shareholders with more demands for capital, which are already constrained from a fiscal perspective, and there is only limited appetite for increasing amounts of money to the World Bank. Although we're being asked to play, an increasingly central role in coordinating multiple stakeholders and delivering both our financing and subject matter expertise to address these very complex and urgent challenges. So it's also true that on the one hand, the governments who are certainly taking the right, most of them anyway, are taking the right policy approaches, taking the right commitments, making the right pronouncements, but they're all constrained by fiscal realities. And this is both developed and developing countries. It's not just the developing countries. And then we have the World Bank, as I said, which has relatively limited capacity as a financial institution to lend. So how are we going to meet the challenge? And I think the answer really is in finding ways to mobilize private capital, because it just so happens that the world's savings are in the hands of the private sector, just because the way the world economy has evolved since the Second World War, and we have pension funds, insurance companies, and other asset managers that have become the primary repositories of capital. And I think tapping that huge pool of money is certainly one way to realistically push forward the agenda, which requires resources far in excess of the capacity of either the World Bank Group or even other multilaterals and the governments to take care of this challenge. But the issue is not that simple, simply because the people who are repositories of this capital are repositories in a fiduciary capacity. They are obligated to their primary stakeholders, which is their insurance beneficiaries or pension beneficiaries or people who have invested their money in expectation of a contractual return, if in an asset management company, and they just can't go out and invest for however urgent or critical the cause might be, if it does not meet with their risk return guidelines and if it does not align with their obligations to their stakeholders, both legal and fiduciary. And so I think the role that the World Bank has is essentially, we can call it de-risking, we can call it facilitation, we can call it, by many, many terms. But in the end, what we're trying to do, and what we have to do, is to create conditions and create circumstances that these investments in emerging market climate projects and other initiatives essentially meet the risk return thresholds. They are brought to a point through various interventions that get to that risk return threshold that will allow those very large sums of money to flow to these markets and to these projects. And the purpose of why this lab has been set up really is to get really candid, clear, market-based feedback on what precisely we need to do and do now. There are a lot of conversations around this world of, getting a lot of institutional investor money flowing, unlocking private capital and all that sort of thing. But there aren't that many conversations that are anchored in market reality. And the difference, I think, the lab has with many, many other conversations on the topic is that this conversation is anchored in market reality. The members of the lab are large financial institutions who have an interest in investing, but are facing obstacles in essentially unlocking huge amounts of capital that are needed. And what we're discussing and what we are seeking is, what do you these private market players, what do you think we, the World Bank, can do, given our charter, given our capabilities, to help you with this, to move in this direction a lot further than you are able to go today otherwise. That's number one. And then the issue is also what we can do better, because we are already doing a lot of things to move capital in that direction, but what can we do better? So what can we do incrementally or completely new, and what we can do better with whatever we are doing today? Now, the process is fairly straightforward. The intent is to collect these candid, I would say, subject matter expertise-driven recommendations, consider those internally, and then make a decision. Which are the ones that we're going to pursue? Some of those we are going to pursue internally, i.e. as projects that are internal to the World Bank Group. And by that, I mean all three entities, IFC, MIGA, and IBRD. But also there'll be some that will require sort of joint, work and joint follow-up with either lab member institutions or other market counterparties, just in the normal course of business of the bank, as we normally do, but with a sense of urgency that has not been seen before. And it's quite fascinating as I'm going through this process and helping facilitate this conversation between the World Bank and its various entities and the private sector partners, is the amount of possibility that we have here. There is firstly just an information gap that we are filling. A lot of institutions we thought know us, but they don't. And I think filling this information gap already is, I think, a major win for everybody. That's number one, what we can and cannot do. The next thing is also to understand the pain points, exactly what is needed, what is stopping the actual movement of capital where it can move today, and what needs to be done for it to move in much greater scale in the future. Some of the things are, fairly well known and fairly well sort of understood by this group, so I don't need to repeat that. In terms of de-risking, in terms of project preparation, enabling environment, reducing off-taker risks. So, these are, talked about ad nauseum in, literally every forum. But what is really interesting is the possibility of a change in approach. And what do I mean by that? So by that I mean is firstly taking much more of a early stage and I would say comprehensive partnership role. That's number one. Number two, I think, is take the World Bank Group as a whole, taking a role that I think is more appropriate for such an institution in the current environment, which is acting as more of an ecosystem utility, acting as a catalytic provider of enabling interventions and not necessarily simply a provider of financing. Because as of now, yes, we have had a very big subject matter expertise role. We've held people's hand over the years in multiple areas and that's very valued by a number of our stakeholders, both in terms of our shareholders and member countries who are receiving the support. But we have really not seen, especially the bank, as a major mobilizer of capital. So, we mobilized close to 50 billion or so last year, which is nothing, which is a drop in the ocean when we look at it. I mean, if 3-4 big projects in the Middle East are 50 billion, it's nothing. And so what we need is, how do we mobilize, go from 50 billion to 500 billion, or 5 trillion? And that is the thrust of the discussion now, as to how do we get to that kind of approach. And there are multiple ways in which we can move in that direction. I can't say that it's easy, as Sean said, nothing is easy. At the same time, also, there may be things that will require the delivery of additional capabilities to the World Bank Group to play that kind of role. So if the charter was not really designed, way back in 45 to us to serve as, this kind of mobilizing ecosystem utility. IFC was to a large degree, but even IFC has limitations on what it can do. So I think that is certainly one of the fundamental objectives of what we are trying to achieve, is how do we change the game in terms of our ability to be a different type of entity that is much more able and effective in mobilizing much larger amounts of capital. So that's a discussion, that's a work in progress, but the level of enthusiasm, the level of collaboration we are getting, the fact that 17 CEOs are donating their time, they're meeting every few weeks. I'm surprised that they can find the time for us to do that, and devoting a lot of other staff and teams on a technical level to pursue things that they're recommending is absolutely astounding. And it just is a verification of the fact that the message has gone through, I think, very well in an ever-increasing part of the global financial community. And that, to me, is a very positive sign. Thank you.
Thanks, Arun. That's a very, very hopeful message. And I must say, we also saw recently Ajay Banga convene a meeting of all the CEOs of the multilateral development banks, from AIIB, New Development Bank to African Development Bank and so on. And there's this wonderful photo opportunity, which is the first time in many years, as fast as I can remember, of all the CEOs together talking about this topic. We have cooperation becoming the norm now at this level. This is, of course, an example of what we can do at country levels and so on. I think it's an example. Jacob, can I bring you in now to reflect on what you just heard and your thoughts about other measures that we need to take to be able to change our system to better cooperate, collaborate, prepare, drive the change?
Sure, thanks. And I think indeed you're right, Sean. Cooperation is the word. It's kind of interesting to see, you know, a number of articles coming out now. Oh, the Inflation Reduction Act, EU Green Deal, this new sort of scaling of competition. And I mean, what we're used to is global competition as a race to the bottom, and this feels like a race to the top. And what's more, it's predicated on a cooperation around joint objectives. Sure, the countries are competing for the individual competitiveness of their industries and sectors and individual activities, but fundamentally underpinning this sort of competition is unparalleled cooperation. And of course, it's one of the reasons, if we're honest, that, you know, we wouldn't have antitrust conversations here, whether it's at business level, and you might even argue at national level, even though the concept doesn't exist, if there wasn't this kind of cooperation. Even if it doesn't fall foul of antitrust measures, it speaks to the idea that there is so much talking happening between businesses and between governments. So I think that's so important to center. And I mean, that is really the underlying theme rather than competition, I would say. So maybe just two or three very brief points. I think number one, in terms of what we just heard in the discussion, Margarita is obviously right to a degree. We don't know what the future will bring, but investors have to take a view and financial institutions have to take a view. And so it's critical that they take that view. It isn't just enough to say, we would like the world to be 1.5. What matters is you allocate capital based on what you believe about the future. And so we need to start doing this exercise. One of the things that we're now doing at the Inevitable Policy Response is we have our forecast, but we're working with a number of investors, and this is an open invitation to the community here at Climate Bonds Connect, to actually provide a climate forecasting tool to investors to use themselves. So they can build their own forecast and build their own transition plan, right? And that is beyond the 1.5. That is really, what do you believe the future will bring? So this climate forecasting tool is now with about half a dozen investors. We're having these conversations about really building your in-house forecast. So that's the first thing that needs to happen. And whether it's with IPR or whether with somebody else, we really need to start getting into the conversation of what we think will happen, recognizing the uncertainty, but we don't have a choice if we want to allocate capital. We have to take a view. That's number one. I think number two is that this solutions portfolio that we are exploring, and this is one of the beauties of the sustainable finance space writ large, breeds a lot of creativity. So where should this cooperation should be channeled is, as I mentioned before, to de-risking. And by the way, one key sort of missing piece here is that when the global financial crisis happened, we had bank reform to make banks more resilient. After the pandemic, we've looked at pandemic, but we haven't looked at broader corporate resilience and corporate strengthening. That corporate resilience is so crucial to de-risking, Sean, you mentioned it yourself. So what are the measures for cooperation? It's business interruption insurance. Why don't we look at mandatory business interruption insurance to avoid the bailouts that the polar crisis will have? And by the way, to also help facilitate the transition. The second is force majeure clauses. We still write contracts that have a clause that say act of God, as if climate and weather is an act of God. Unless we all think we're the gods, that's no longer the case. So we need to have contracts that really reflect this new risky world. And this is such an easy area to collaborate on. This isn't imposing hundreds of trillions of dollars of taxes on the economy. It's simply actually reducing costs for businesses to operate by clarifying the rules of business interruption, building insurance that sort of paves over business interruption, and making sure the contracts that we deal with, that we use in our day-to-day interactions, reflect a world that makes it clear. So we're not sitting in courts debating, having judges decide whether climate change is a force majeure or not. This is a ridiculous state of affairs. And so I think these are such simple ways that this cooperation, Sean, that you described can move forward. And we should not let the pessimism about some of the narrative that we're now competing and the geopolitical tensions hide the fact that, as you say, Sean, these taxonomy conversations are being coordinated. Transition plan conversations are being coordinated by governments around the world, and not the least with the initiative that the Climate Bonds has announced today around the transition plan work. So these are the areas where cooperation is needed. And of course, then we can start thinking about the hard bits, right? Do we need capital requirement equivalents for corporates to deal with such a risky world? This is going to be a controversial one, no doubt. But there are such low-hanging fruits to explore, and I really hope that we can do it. Number one, investors should start forecasting the transition instead of just looking at the hypotheticals. Number two, we should build on the cooperation to de-risk. And number three, we should use those low-hanging fruits to really make sure that business stability and corporate resilience is at the center of allowing the global economy to transition. Because without that corporate resilience in a more risky climate change world, the transition simply won't happen.
Nice, Jacob. Thank you. I'm going to go to Margarita now, because Jacob's got us into some detail here about how we work. Of course, we're looking globally. I'm curious about what you see happening and what you see can happen in the relationship between investors and governments in this context of getting governments to act, pushing governments to act together.
Yeah, so first, what can investors do, all else being equal? Several years ago, we started a project with our colleagues from UNEP FI and Generation Foundation called the Legal Framework for Impact. That was in 2018, 2019, with the very simple question, actually, can investors pursue goals such as 1.5? Are they allowed to do this? Are they supposed to just make money? And so law firm Freshfields provided 2 years later a 500-page response to the question, saying, actually, yes, investors are generally permitted. They did the analysis over 11 jurisdictions, and all the jurisdictions are different. The overall answer was similar. So investors can do it. Sometimes they can be required to pursue sustainability goals like 1.5 when pursuing such goals intentionally, deliberately, will help them secure financial return, which remains the primary goal of an investor. So there is this absolutely new way of looking at sustainability goals, such as 1.5, in a goal-oriented world. It is no longer about just manage the risks to your portfolio of what happens out there, climate change, the act of God, as Jacob was saying. No, those are things that are happening. Those are things that governments are aiming to address. 1.5 is in law in many jurisdictions, and therefore investors have to align to those goals because this can be instrumental in securing financial return. Again, going to the idea that financial returns and economic growth rely on the economic, environmental, and social systems which are being threatened by the current poly crisis. So investors can do it, but how can they do it? So obviously they can, use their allocate capital, use taxonomies to check to what extent they're aligned with 1.5 or not. They can also be more active owners of capital. So stewardship is an important lever of change in the real economy. So collaborative engagement is even a stronger lever of change. And this is why we've seen recently a lot of jurisdictions telling investors it's okay to collaborate on sustainability issues under this and that criteria. So it is really important to set legal clarity on the collaboration that you're both talking about. So the second lever is stewardship. The third lever is policy engagement. Actually, referring to what you said earlier, Sean, now there is a much stronger collaboration between business investors and policymakers and in multilateral organizations. This is really important because investors need to tell policymakers when policymakers do something right. They need to tell policymakers when they do something wrong, because policymakers alone won't be able to design the good policies that we need as investors to allocate capital efficiently. This is an unprecedented situation. No policymaker, government representative has studied this in school. How do you reorient entire economies towards a long-term goal that the said economy will not reach if you don't set the right rules in place? Because the rules that govern markets today were written in an era where climate change didn't exist, or it wasn't a topic for governments, a primary topic. It was about growth, jobs, things like that, financial stability. Now you have to add this new long-term goal, and nobody knows how to do it well. But we're seeing essentially in the economic transition, 3 key pillars of reform that investors need to push governments to address. Transition plans alone, disclosures are necessary, but insufficient. So first, we need to address economic externalities. It's been decades since economists have been saying, oh, externalities are, this thing that essentially affects markets, but is not internalized, not priced in. So we have to price carbon. We've been telling this for years and years and years, but addressing externalities is extremely important to embed, to hardwire the apex goal of net zero within the rules of the game. The second pillar is incentivizing markets. Inflation Reduction Act. In the US, where financial regulation is slightly more difficult, I mean, we're hoping for a climate disclosure rule soon, but industrial policy was first. Inflation Reduction Act is essentially incentivizing markets to move to a new direction. This is a very powerful tool, and we're seeing it with the Green Deal in the EU, GX policy in Japan, 1% policy in China, and so on. So governments are understanding that the second pillar is so important, incentivizing markets to go in the direction desired. And the third pillar is financial regulation. This is really important because as much as we know, and Freshfields have told investors and lawyers around the world that investors can pursue sustainability goals such as 1.5, it is important to clarify in guidance, to stress things like duty of impartiality. What does it mean for pension funds? To set the right disclosure tools for corporates, investors, to develop taxonomies, to align those regulations globally so that there are no compliance burdens across markets that hinder capital, to strengthen and codify stewardship obligations, and so on and so forth. So these 3 pillars form what we view as the good approach to the whole of government approach to a transition. And investors have to engage with policymakers, with technical expertise, with support, responding to consultations, and pushing for policy reform, because otherwise we'll have market inefficiencies, we'll have market failures, we'll have things like, new exploration production in oil and more broadly fossil fuels being developed, which will lead to loss of money, not a good use for taxpayers' money, and so on. So yeah, policy engagement. Last but not least.
Great agenda. Thank you. Well argued. Sean.
Just picking up on something you mentioned there, Margarita, I've been appointed to the GRI Insurance Task Force. So the GRI Global Reporting Index comes out of the Global Compact originally, but it's been going for 25 years now, and it's recognized that it's probably not quite fit for purpose. So there are 3 task forces, one for banking, one for investment, one for insurance. And we've just started. Hopefully this time next year, we will have that right policy set in place for businesses to report. And let's face it, what gets measured gets done. So I think this is a really important way forward to help with exactly what you said around the policy side and the framework that we can all drive towards. But I just want to pick up on a point that Jacob said as well. Sorry, Jacob, I've got to disagree. It's not easy to do business interruption. There are 2 organizations that pay for any disaster. One is government and one is insurance. And they don't agree. And that's the problem. When it comes to a disaster, the government officials all take the PR media, and let's face it, the insurers are left out because we're not very good at PR. So from that side, even looking at in this country, obviously we had Pool Re originally, which was a terrorism pool, which is doing what it does, and Flood Re, which took about 8 to 10 years to actually get onto the books. It's funded by the people who pay their premiums for home and motor in this country, but the stumbling block they had was based on egos and what's in it for me mentality, mostly from the government, who said, well, in 25 years we can close it down and we'll keep all of the assets of the risk pool. why? This isn't going to go away. This is climate change. We've got it for life. So let's not forget that that's not easy to do. And there's lots of those risk pools around the world now. They're all being copied and every country is trying to do one. But coming back to the SDG 17, we must play well together. I just want to make 2 points, one on investment and one on impact. And the two are quite separate. On the investment, Mark Carney launched the GFANZ in COP26 2 years ago. I think it's a PRI stat anyway. It's $125 trillion of assets between financial services. So that's investment banking, insurance. It's a large number, and I notice you've got, what, 5,700 now signed up to the PRI. It's a wonderful success story. It was only about 600 5 years ago. So everyone signed up to it, and that was the number he's coming to. But if you in reality look at who has invested in sustainability, it's a very small number. And both Mark Carney and Antonio Guterres recognized that it was far less than 10 trillion of the total 100 and whatever is 30 trillion. I'll just give you a little, again, from a success story from our side. We started measuring investments in sustainable investment frameworks with our members. 4 years ago, it was 250 billion. We've just launched the report last week for this year. It's just gone over 1 trillion. So 4 times increase. So that's momentum. Now, if you multiply that up by all of the other insurers in the world, you'll probably find a similar momentum, I hope. Coming on to the impact bit and what's actually happening, because to be perfectly honest, I think those of us that have been in this a long time are a bit sick of speaking now. Not speaking on panels like this, but sick of the talk that goes on and lack of action. Action is what is now needed. And I rarely go to events now unless there is real action taking place. So we've been building ourselves first 2 benchmarks for the industry. One is an SDG calculator, which we built with Swiss Re, comes under the auspices of the UNEP PSI, which Butch Bacani runs. But between ICMIF members and Swiss Re, we've developed how to measure impact on your SDGs across an insurance industry. Took us 3 years to develop it. This year we've launched it. 20 of our members, which is a very large, all our large ones have taken it on. And it's basically given an underwriting strategy for how we can measure our impact on SDGs. It has been a huge success story. Nobody expected it to be this great. And now they're trying to embed that into their overall strategy of underwriting. So no one else, this is the first in the world. I know UNEP PSI want to do one for the whole industry, and we are giving it into that space to make that happen. The other one is we are 100 years old as an organization last year. We changed our purpose last year, which is to create a safer, more resilient world. That was done with all the members' agreements. And many of our members have that now as their own purpose. So how do we do resiliency? Well, you've got to measure it. Otherwise, it's not going to happen. So we've developed with the UNEP, with the UNDRR, United Nations Disaster Risk Reduction, a resiliency benchmark based on science-based targets, based on what we can see and is being achieved. And again, we launched that this year. So we can actually measure our resilience as a business against a benchmark. Now, we need to have starting points in all of these. If we don't have that starting benchmark, we can't get better and better each year. And both of these benchmarks are doing exactly that. The resilience benchmark and the SDG calculator, we hope, will be brought into the measurement of the GRI. We'd love it if we could start to build it into the green bonds. For us, there's another group as well, which the UNDRR has set up. It's called the Investment Advisory Board. Sean's been part of the advisory group on there. I'm on the board. And that is mostly full of investment people and 2 or 3 insurers. And there's only 12 of us. And they have a passion to create a market for infrastructure investments that is both resilient and SDG compliant. And it is a holy grail. Sean and I have talked about this for many, many years. How do we bring the SDGs into measurement of a success of a green bond? Now, the resilience bonds, I think, is a way forward. It's under your suite, of course, another name, but it's got to be focused on infrastructure investment. At the moment, infrastructure is dominated by governments, local authorities. I think 2% of it actually goes out to the market. We need to scale that up because we need to bring our skill sets from the business world into the government world of investment in infrastructure. God knows if we could actually manage to get them to finish on time and on budget. That's something we do very well in the business world. You know, I'm not going to quote HS2, but that's a prime example of how not to do it. But these things are needed all around the world, and infrastructure has got to have a huge investment in it in order to have the impact and make people more safer, more resilient in flood zones, in energy, in transport, all of these areas. It needs investment. Hello, we've got the money sitting here, 135 billion, only 3 trillion in green bonds. That needs to be 1.5 trillion, you said, sorry. 10 trillion needs to be the target. I think infrastructure is a huge growth market in there, but they need to make these projects investable in. And that's what we're trying to achieve. Because if we're not investable, then we're not going to touch them, let's face it. But that means they're having to change and talk to the business world. And that is happening. Canada's a starting point. And there's another sustainable finance action plan headed by a wonderful lady called Kathy Bardswick, who used to be one of my chairs. It's a government appointee. They've started it. They're sharing everything with their friends in Australia because they're both fossil fuel related organizations. It is starting to happen. So that's another encouraging point. We need to move away from governments controlling infrastructure spend to applying the business now and our money that we sit on to apply it into those, because there's some great returns to be had. Let's face it, this isn't done for solidarity. This isn't done to green our portfolios. This is done because there's good returns in there. You always say that about the green bonds. So resilience bonds is the new way forward. And that's going to happen. We've got to work together on that one. We are.
Of course, 70% of that infrastructure expenditure in the next 20 years, investment, has got to be in emerging markets. Arun, we've got to finish up, but a last word from you in Mumbai, and he's joining us from Mumbai today. You still there, Arun? Okay. We've lost him. We need to wrap up.
I'm there.
Oh, please.
I'm sorry.
A last thought, Arun. You've been listening to this conversation. And Sean just said infrastructure.
Yeah, so I think there are a couple of quick points I want to make. I know we're all over time. The first point is that I think it's the effort that we're making at the bank right now is, as I said, rooted in reality. A lot of these objectives when it comes to emerging markets have very unique challenges that are not really, felt in developed markets. One of them is, of course, FX, because a lot of the capital that is available for investment needs to be remunerated in the currency in which it is, invested. And so that creates foreign exchange risk. And it's a real issue because infrastructure projects in these countries, whether it's for, resilience or other purposes, all needs local currency, and it produces local currency cash flows. And over a long term, and it is literally impossible to hedge so easily. So one of the challenges that we have, and we all know that FX is currency risk is a macroeconomic issue. It's, good old purchasing power parity is not going to go anywhere, that challenge. So, and since we can't hedge the entire economy, one of the, I think, interesting pathways forward in that space is to reward good opportunities with FX cover that essentially makes the return on capital acceptable to international investors, assuming, of course, all the other aspects of an infrastructure project are workable. The other, I think, observation I have is, again, something that the market is raising as well, is to really take a holistic approach from the World Bank Group. We've been advising on single projects for years. But now more and more, I think the feeling from the market is that, the private sector is, very competent. They know what to do when it comes to assessing a project, evaluating its risk, underwriting it, structuring the financing. They can do all that, but the World Bank Group should be really creating a scalable program that once it's there and is addressing, certain key obstacles that are stopping the show for the moment, and really remove those showstoppers so that the private sector can play at scale on its own without necessarily the World Bank Group being involved financially in each project. So that's, again, a transformative change in the approach that has been proposed and is being considered. And I think that will make a huge difference. We have already done it at a small scale in Africa in a program that was very successful called Scaling Solar. And I think that sort of thing, where essentially what we're doing is we are creating a environment where the private sector can come and make its capabilities available is I think certainly a very important way forward. The final point, I think, is that on the insurance side, one of the ways in which I think a lot of these issues can be addressed is the insurance world looking at deploying unfunded insurance capacity as opposed to funded investments. Because again, the great thing about insurance and unfunded participations is that they essentially get rid of the FX risk issue. Once you are essentially because there's enough liquidity in multiple markets, nobody really needs the hard currency. What they need is risk appetite. And if the risk appetite can come from the insurance world, that can be a real game changer in moving this forward. So that's another discussion we're having with some of the insurance members in the lab, but also potentially with others as well. And that's a discussion I think we can potentially have with the Insurance Development Forum as well in the future.
Thanks,
So
Arun.
I'll
Thank
stop
you.
there.
Thank you very much. Allocate capital based on future, design enabling policy to reduce the risks of going green, meet our risk reward thresholds. But remember, cooperation and collaboration are predictors of resilience. That applies at a neighborhood level and applies at a planetary level. How do we make this work? Please say thank you to our panelists. We're going to have a coffee break in about 2 minutes. We've got a whole lot of Climate Bond staff in the room. Stand up, please, all your Climate Bond staff. Quickly, 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 because these are the people you're going to go and grill over coffee to say what's going on, what are you doing in climate bonds. Now, Kathy Bowman-McLeod, my good friend from Climate Resilience for All, is going to do a 5 minutes max on switch. Go.
Thank you. Good morning. 5 minutes. Fire starter. We're going to have to come up with some new phrases around these quick conversations we have about climate change. Fire starters and fireside chats. They don't work anymore. It's hot as hell out there. I'm Kathy Bowman-McLeod. I'm the CEO of Climate Resilience for All. With 5 minutes, I'm going to talk about three things. First, it's hot. It's very hot. How many of you have had your plans interrupted by a climate disaster or stress? The metro's closed down, your school's closed, your vacation was canceled, something's flooded. Hands up. Yeah, okay. So it's happening to you. It's not just happening to places in the global south that have been dealing with heat and flood and fire for longer than the global north. And those in the global north are not as ready for it. Our buildings, our clothes, our whole sets. The cost of worker productivity losses in the United States as a baseline in 2020 is $100 billion in worker productivity losses. 18% of those losses are disproportionately borne by Black and Hispanic workers. The tube in London is hotter than is legal to transport livestock on lots of days in the heat season. So you're feeling it too. A worker in New Delhi loses a quarter of their income every day when they work outside. It evaporates. And we can't see it and we can't hear it. My second point, gender. Women are disproportionately impacted by climate change. Women also invest 90% of what they make into their communities. Men, anybody want to guess, men, what your contribution is when what you put back into your community? Or throw out a number. If women are 90, just shout it out.
5,
20.
40. So men put 40%, women put 90%. If you are an investor, what should you be doing? Invest in women. Invest in women. Invest in projects that have consulted women. Invest in projects led by women. Invest in projects designed by women. Third point, just transition. Just transition. So we think about the transition, first of all, we think about energy naturally. We have to transition from these practices to these practices. Then we use the word just transition. So just means a lot of things. What does just mean to you? Does it mean that it's fair? Does it mean it has, that it's equitable? When we think about just transition, we have to think about the people, transitioning for who? Who are we doing this for? And so let's just say infrastructure, if the infrastructure doesn't work for vulnerable communities, we're doing it wrong. Vulnerable communities are the backbone of our economy. They are our supply chain and our workforce. And so thinking about these climate effects and how they land in communities is really important. The last thing I'll leave you with is this idea of just returns. Let me call it something else. When we think about the canary in the coal mine, and the Financial Times has covered a couple of stories about State Farm and other insurers pulling out of the California market. The canary is dead. The signal has been sent. It is time for us to change the way we think about the financial system. And there are so many fantastic efforts going on, including these, and including in the insurance industry. I'm a part of the Insurance Development Forum, so is Sean. There are many efforts going on to help us look at the financial system and our financial architecture. However, if the returns that we expect include harm to people and planet, not priced in, and the risk and the cost and the impact is pushed to the public balance sheet, it just doesn't work out. And so I want to highlight that a just transition also means transitioning our thinking about the time it takes for those returns and what's in those returns. And it's happening in front of us. And the beauty of the human race is that we adapt beautifully and quickly. But these big problems, our brains are sort of feeble. We're having a hard time getting our minds around the morass and the bigness of climate. And so think about who the transition's for, think about the quantified impacts of climate, and all of these things, we can do them. And I think my 5 minutes is up because Sean is standing up. And so it's really, really nice to be here. Climate Resilience for All, we are a gender lens organization focused on addressing the many impacts of extreme heat in vulnerable communities around the world. The financial system is critical in us doing that. Thank you for having me.
Refreshments, please. Exit over there.